the first question I want to delve into this morning is this. Why a guarantee at all? Because I'm sure there's some folks out there who don't even know why we're talking about this. So why would one need to guarantee a lease with a commercial tenant, especially here in New York City? You have a lot of sophisticated tenants. Presumably a landlord is going to rent to a tenant who he thinks can pay the rent. So why a guarantee?
Well, Michele, guarantees are a regular form of lease transactions in the city of New York and elsewhere. And the reason is that a landlord who's renting space to a tenant wants to make sure that the tenant is going to do what the tenant says it's going to do in the lease. So the most obvious form of obligation that the landlord is interested in is the payment of rent and additional rent. So, and there are many other obligations, including, if there's construction, build out, getting a C of O, various obligations that a tenant undertakes when it or he or she signs a lease agreement. Now, if a tenant signs a lease agreement and it's what we call a shell corporation or a shell limited liability company, that is, the entity has no assets behind it, the promise is only as good as the performance. So that if the tenant at some point along the way during the course of the lease term stops performing, stops paying rent, stops doing any of the obligations that it's required to do under the lease, then the landlord wants to be able to look to assets to enforce those obligations.
So wait, let me ask you this. Why would a tenant be a shell corporation?
Typically, most tenants and entities that sign leases in the form of an entity so that they could limit liability. Nobody wants to put their life savings at risk for a business enterprise. So
in other words,
even a national corporation, for instance, a bank. You walk around the city, you see all these Bank of America locations, or Chase Bank. Even banks, when they sign a lease, will not sign as the main bank. They will have an entity, a subsidiary entity, enter into the lease so that if the location doesn't work out for them, they can depart the location without putting greater assets at risk.
So, in other words, many companies will form an LLC just for the purpose of holding the lease, and then their company will sublease from the LLC.
Well, there are very many, there are different ways that it can be handled depending on the kind of business it is. So if it's a restaurant company, the restaurant is most likely going to have a limited liability company operating in that location. The receipts will probably be received in the name of that entity, although it's not necessarily true. They can certainly, subdivide that so that the assets that come in are not subject to the landlord's ability to recapture if they don't meet their obligations.